Would you mind telling us your name and introducing yourself and telling us what you do?
Yes, my name's Tony Gosling. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a radio show in Bristol where we have a political and investigative show every week on a Friday, thisweek.org.uk. But the main reason I'm here is to look at the Bilderbergs, and I've got another website which is bilderberg.org. I got hold of the domain name back in the 1990s, funnily enough, because someone gave me I was absolutely broke at the time, and it was the sister of one of Henry Kissinger's goddaughters that gave me 150 quid to buy the domain and set up a website.
Really? Why did she do that?
Well, because she doesn't necessarily buy into her godfather or her sister's godfather's ideas. Wow. Kissinger, of course, is one of the world's worst war criminals, and if the police around here are interested in any kind of anti-terror legislation, he's the guy they should nail. He's the guy that should have the handcuffs on in the Black Maria today.
Yeah, definitely, with all the actions he's caused in Timor and Indonesia and Chile, is just amazing to see a man like that being able to walk free.
But he can't. This is another point, Luke, is that he can't. In many countries around the planet, I think I'm right in saying France and Italy and Europe, various other countries, if he gets off a plane in those countries, immediately he's in jail. And he's quite well aware of that. In fact, Daniel Mashover, a Jewish lawyer in London, has been doing a lot of work in trying to get basically prohibition orders on many war criminals. He's been very successful with Israelis. And what does David Cameron and the Conservative government do? One of the first things they came into office is overturn the laws in this country that allow us to arrest war criminals. Yeah. Unbelievable, really.
The US did the same thing a couple of years back.
But so Kissinger's getting limited in the number of countries he can go around to. You have to beam him in by satellite now.
That's why I asked him, how does it feel to be wanted for mass murder in so many countries? And he didn't really reply. He called me a coward for asking him that.
When he was interviewed by Jeremy Paxman on the BBC, who said, does it feel a fraud to have got the Nobel Peace Prize, he actually stormed out of the studio. Wow. All you heard was the bang of a door and Mr. Kissinger left. Anyway, the man has got lots and lots and lots of criminal, certainly evidence against him, and it really is disgusting that he's allowed to walk around. But it's not just him. In this particular meeting we've got loads. I mean, it's great that they've given us out the list well beforehand. Yes, thank you very much. Back when I was covering this in the early mid-90s, actually quite often you would only have 3 or 4 journalists trying to cover it. Hardly anybody even knew it was going on. But also the press release by the Bilderbergs, you'd get that after the conference. After the last car had left, you used to get the old press release. They'd finally give it to you. Here we've had quite a lot of time to look at who's in there. HSBC Bank figure massively. Now, you in the States will know a lot about them because they've had a bit of a hard time in the courts over money laundering. Yeah. Now, this is no joke, money laundering, because the Mexican drug cartels have been literally going into villages that have criticised what they're doing and murdering scores and scores of people, leaving piles of bodies on the edges of the villages. HSBC, it seems, were quite happy to run these people's cash around in their armoured vans for years and years. They are the criminals. They are other people. As soon as they actually... No, let's not wait till they leave. Let's send the police in there to put them in handcuffs now. Because they certainly should be arrested and questioned, if not actually just simply jailed. I mean, we've got to have a proper legal process here, but none of that is happening. It's all out-of-court settlements. So loads of HSBC people, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, and also Barclays, several Barclays people too. Barclays have committed this massive LIBOR fraud, which has taken billions of pounds and dollars from people with mortgages around the world, mostly in Europe and the United States. Again, no proper prosecutions, not behind bars for the directors. Now, the funny thing is that may change. This is positive news, because there's a guy called Rain Man. He's called Rain Man, nickname basically, because he's a slightly inept socially. I mean, I hate to say that if you're watching, but anyway, his name was Tom Hayes. Tom, sorry man. But anyway, he was the world's top LIBOR trader. And he was shunted between one bank and another bank and another bank, mostly in the city here in London, UBS and various other Barclays possibly, I'm not sure which exact banks. But he was paid more than anybody else in the city. Now, don't tell me that the guys who are at the tops of these banks and the middle managers didn't know what was going on. When he was signed from UBS, he was given a $3 million signing fee. That's just for one day, popping into his bank account, $3 million. Now, Rain Man knows all about what happened with the LIBOR crimes. So the US wants him over there. They've tried to extradite him over to the United States, poor old Tom. But the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police are chatting with him, saying, well, hang on a minute, don't you think you could tell us a little bit more about, before we let you go? But this has left him in a very difficult position, because how long is this going to go on for? Maybe none of this is ever going to come out. Maybe all these names he's giving them, they're not going to prosecute anybody. So what's happened is recently, Luke, and people might want to check this out, his girlfriend has been tweeting. His bird has been tweeting and telling the world little bits more about Tom Hayes. So the libel fraud thing certainly isn't over. Barclays was one of the first banks to fess up. Of course, what happens with HSBC and Barclays when they do these out-of-court settlements is their stock price goes way up as soon as they agree a settlement, because of course all the investors and the shareholders, etc., are expecting, crikey, they might close the bank down and we lose all our money. But no, it's a nice little cosy out-of-court settlement. And that's what makes me think that Britain and many other countries in the Western world are rather like banana republics, not like proper, I wouldn't put my money in here, don't put your money here, put it somewhere safe. Maybe in an Islamic country with a safe economy that's got trustworthy banks, people who are honest, because I'm afraid you can't trust the City of London anymore, nor Wall Street. Although it's good to see actually in the States, there seems to be more prosecutions happening over in the US than in the City. The City is the blue bloods, it's a cult, a club. And nobody in that circle, it seems, is going to be prosecuted. That's ever since really the early 90s. The words come down from on high, do what you want, any kind of fraud, and you won't get prosecuted. Now, that's not the rule of law. All we're asking for, Luke, is the rule of law, isn't it?
It seems like if you have money, the rule of law doesn't apply to you. And it seems like they're just getting away with so many heinous crimes. But on a separate note, I was always wondering, when owning Bilderberg.org, I was wondering, did you get any offers from anybody to buy it from you? Was there any even Bilderberg members who tried to buy that domain off of you?
Well, funnily enough, no. And I think one of the things, that they don't like any publicity. But they know me as a former BBC journalist. I would be straight on the phone to the BBC, and I would be on the phone to the newspapers saying, hey, Bilderberg have just asked it, and they've got a great little story there. So I think they sort of they've gone around me a little bit. I did actually ask once a few years ago to speak at their conference. I sent them a nice polite letter to the office in Leiden in Holland to speak. And they didn't reply. After a few weeks I sent another letter and they finally did reply with a one-word no, basically. But I mean, I think that there's all sorts of room inside that toxic atmosphere in there for great ideas. Things like debt forgiveness. Let's forgive these debts that are unpayable. Yeah? Let's also, I mean, are they going to be talking about prosecuting the bankers? We've had Mervyn King, the Governor of the Bank of England, recently saying, well, we've got to stop bashing the bankers. Not a single banker has been bashed, Luke. I've news for you, bankers, guys. Nothing's happened. One person I'd definitely advise you to look at is Rowan Bosworth-Davies. His blog, he's a former Scotland Yard fraud squad officer, worked there for 12 years. And his job in Scotland Yard was bashing down the doors of the bankers at 4 a.m. and dragging them out and putting them in jail cells overnight. He said it had a very interesting effect on their behaviour. And so Rowan has got all sorts of interesting stuff about how to do this. He's also proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that what's going on in the city is organised crime. It fits with all the definitions of organised crime in Europe, in the United States, the British definition, the Japanese definition, and he's laid them all out there on his blog. So it's called Rowan's blog, I think. But Rowan is a great guy. Also, he's a bit of a wit, and he doesn't take this whole thing too seriously, but he's absolutely clear. If this country wants to move forward and out of the dire financial situation we're in with disabled people committing suicide, poor people committing suicide because they're having basic things taken away from them, then we've got to arrest these guys.
Tell us about the Nigerian who contacted you. I heard that a Nigerian dictator contacted you and wanted in on the Bilderberg group.
Just remember, it wasn't Nigerian, no. Hang on. Oh, that's right, yes. I got a call a few years ago. I was sitting in a cafe in Gloucester Docks from the office of the President of Malawi. And there was a very nice lady on the phone saying, the President's with me and he would like to join the Bilderberg group. Anyway, I did wind her up a little bit and I said, has he got lots of money? Yeah. But anyway, the point being, I mean, for example, right now they're discussing Africa in there.
Yeah.
The challenges for Africa, they call it. And yet not a single African person is invited to the Bilderberg meetings. It's only the NATO countries. Now, Luke, this is disgusting. This is a throwback to the bad old colonial days of slavery and viciousness towards foreigners. And That is the insult that Bilderberg is spreading around the world by having a conference discussion topic of challenges for Africa without any Africans allowed in the room.
Yeah.
Unbelievable, disgusting. And I think, the world needs to know just what kind of a monstrosity is going on in there. Now, these guys, basically, what they're doing is they're using corporations and banks like Hitler used tank divisions, panzer divisions, to take over. That's essentially what's going on. And if you're interested in the connections between the Bilderbergers and the Nazis, check out Jacob Wallenberg, because one of your great CBS correspondents from the war, who was over here during the Second World War, wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and he mentions the Wallenberg family as part of that. Now, what Martin Bormann did after the end of the Second World War, he was Hitler's basically personal secretary. The British, it seemed, smuggled him out and he got over to South America, but he set up 750 corporations. All these ex-Nazis then took off their swastikas, put on suits and became directors of these corporations. And they then went, the money was laundered, all the loot from the war was laundered through Sullivan and Cromwell's law firm in New York, and that money from the war was then invested in those companies. And this was basically the Fourth Reich. This is the trick the Nazis were going to pull. They were going to use the loot from World War II to set up a financial empire, and Bilderberg represents that. And one of the most obvious things is the first chairman for the first 20 years was an officer in the SS before the war. So, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really.
Yeah, Vernon Jordan told me that he wasn't an SS officer and he had no ties to the Nazis. Can you tell us about some of the evidence that disproves that?
It's real. Sorry, Vernon. Sorry, mate, but you're totally wrong. Yeah. You go into Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands' biography. I think it's Alden Hatch wrote it. There's a whole section there where he talks about he was in the SS before the war, and it's quite clearly in his biography. So Vernon obviously hasn't read Bernhard's biography. The other thing about Bernhard is he denied being a member of the Nazi Party. He said, "Oh, I just joined the SS because it was a good way of getting ahead." It's now come out. The Dutch are very, very keen on getting to the bottom of who this guy was, because he was a German aristocracy that married into the Dutch royal family. They've discovered records from his university days where he was in fact in the Nazi Party. He was a consummate liar. After his 20 years of chairing the Bilderberg conferences from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, after those, he had something called the Lockheed scandal. Yeah. You're probably too young to remember that. I can just about remember it.
The jets that he was paid off by Lockheed Martin to buy.
Lockheed paid him $1 million to get the Dutch Air Force to buy these rubbishy Lockheed starfighters that had little tiny wings and fell out of the sky. But it was a chambermaid in his hotel room, picked up a bit of paper from his litter bin, and Bernhard was in the papers in Holland and discredited, and then he had to leave. Now there's also some connections with World War II, because the very first ever Bilderberg conference was held in a little town called Oosterbeek on the edge of Arnhem, in exactly the same spot as the Bridge Too Far battle took place, that is Operation Market Garden. There was a pocket of the British 1st Airborne Division surrounded by Nazi soldiers, by tanks, by flamethrowing tanks, by rocket launchers, and we were massacred, man, in that little pocket. In exactly the same spot is where you'll find the Bilderberg Hotel in the first meeting 10 years after that battle. At the time, the Nazis called it the Hexenkessel, the Witches Cauldron, because so many British were being killed in that little pocket. And I think that was a bit of an in-joke. That the Nazis thought, yeah, this is where we got the Brits, let's start a new little conference in there. And most of the people for the first decades of the conference were never aware that that's where the Bilderberg Hotel is, and that's where the Bilderberg name came from. Wow. That successful battle where the Nazis trounced the British and stopped them getting to Berlin. We had every chance of getting to Berlin and ending the war by the end of 1944 at that point, right? The only thing was, Lord Carrington, who was another chairman of Bilderberg, was sitting in a tank at Nijmegen Bridge, and if you've seen the film A Bridge Too Far, Robert Redford goes up to this guy who's playing Carrington and says, "Get down the road, guys, get down the road, your guys are dying in Arnhem." And Carrington is sitting there making a cup of tea. Now, I actually spoke to one of your 82nd Airborne captains, who was at the time, who's still alive, Moffat T. Burris, or T. Moffat Burris. He said he went over to Carrington, because he'd lost half of his men taking that bridge. He pointed his Tommy gun at Carrington's head and said, "Get down that blankety-blank road now, yeah? Or I'll blow your blankety-blank head off." So there was a bit of a confrontation with Carrington. Now the allegation here is that Carrington deliberately didn't go and rescue the Brits at that operation in order to extend the war, to allow the Nazis time to get their loot out of Europe, to South America, to Scandinavia, to Indonesia and various other places, because they needed a bit more time to get all these securities, the gold and the paintings and this kind of thing out of the country.
Wow, I never knew any of this amazing history that you're telling me, so I'm really enjoying this interview. But I was wondering if you could pick one piece of evidence that's most damning to the Bilderberg Group. What would that one piece of evidence be?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one.
I know,
one piece of evidence.
It means secret.
Okay, no, I think I've got it. From last year, they had this Syrian National Council. Charlie Skelton did a brilliant article in The Guardian all about this. This is a fake version of the Syrian people, basically created by NATO and also attending at the Bilderberg, giving themselves a kind of front, pretending to be real people from Syria, but it's not at all. It's a pretend version of that. And what they're doing now, of course, is they're funding all sorts of terror groups within Syria in order to try and overthrow the regime. Now, Assad is a dictator, you know, he's not the greatest guy on earth, but actually what they're doing is this, they could be starting World War III here, so they need to back off. Stop giving those Islamic terrorists, who by the way are being kind of conned by using the Quran, saying, oh, you know, this is all in the prophecy, you can be a hero for Allah. And there's con men in there too, you know, getting these guys going. We've got to stop supplying weapons to these terrorists in Syria. Let the place turn back to the beautiful, peaceful country it always has been. And by the way, we've got a British woman who's married to Assad, who we never see on the BBC. Let's have a little bit of her on the BBC. She's a very beautiful and very well-educated woman, and I think that actually, even though it's a dictatorship, they're doing everything they can to allow much more plurality, to have opposition parties in Syria now, and they've allowed that. So let's let them get on with it and return to the sort of peace and culture we had. We don't want it being another US, UK, European, basically McDonaldization of Syria is not on the cards as far as I'm concerned.
Two more quick questions. How do you feel being here with all these people here and the mainstream media finally picking up after being here in the 90s with just 3 people?
Well, it's brilliant. It's lovely to see so many people looking at this, but I mean, we've still got to understand, what do we do with them?
Yeah.
How do we get the police to turn around and start arresting the real criminals and stop trying to frighten? Actually, the police have been pretty good, Luke, you know, between you there. They realise...
Not as bad as American police.
That's right, yes, that's right. They could be pretty tough over there.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that there's also an intellectual understanding by the police that something's gone very horribly wrong, particularly in the city and with our politics. And while all the time you've got much of the media, I mean, for example, through the Telegraph and Conrad Black, who was controlling the Daily Telegraph, News International, Rupert Murdoch's empire. His general manager was in here for many years, he's not on the list, maybe he's come around the back today. All the time you've got politicians and the media involved in this. I'm afraid that we're never going to actually see our way through it. We've got to get rid of those politicians that come in here. In fact, you know, we should be grilling them what's been going on inside, and if they don't tell us, then I mean, I think they should be arrested like they would be in the United States under the Logan Act.
Or they're not telling us anything, especially when I grill them. It's very difficult to get anything out of them. But I'm just really fascinated.
I think it's a bit like a cult, Luke. Don't you think? It's got the cult-like thing, hasn't it?
It is.
You know, you come in, it's almost like Hotel California. You can check out any time, but you can never leave. That means you have to carry the burden of the Bilderberg if you're a politician around with you for years afterwards. I heard this, but I'm not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah.
You can't actually have that kind of situation in the free world. So we need to end all that.
They swear secrecy, sign disclosure contracts, and they can't say anything, sadly. But I'm still fascinated by this one point you talked about with the Nigerian or the African dictator.
We got a bit distracted.
Yeah, we got a bit distracted. I mean, that's just a fascinating story. I mean, what was said? How did everything transpire? I just find that fascinating.
Well, eventually I explained to the guy that Africans are not allowed in the Bilderberg, and that it's only for people in the NATO countries. And many people don't understand it. When people say, "Oh, they control the world," of course they don't. They control much of what goes on in much of the commerce that goes on in the NATO countries, and they're also taking over many of our political parties, and they're setting the agenda a lot of the times through the media, through think tanks, from policy groups, and this kind of thing. There's a massive amount of money goes through charitable money. In fact, the Bilderberg, we found out this time, has got some kind of weird charity going on here in Britain, where they're supposed to be educating everybody, but it's all secret, you know.
Yeah.
So I think the Charity Commission should have a look at that for a start. But the Malawi president was very disappointed that he wasn't allowed to be part of it, and I explained that there's many people in other parts of the world who also would like to be in on it, but they're not allowed to be because it's NATO only.
Did he try to bribe you?
No, he didn't. But I had a bit of a laugh about it with his secretary. I didn't actually speak to him personally. I could hear him on the other side of the room.
Wow.
So, you know, I'm afraid that's all only NATO countries. And as NATO expands, you'll find more people coming in. Ultimately, though, NATO, Paul Hauser, SS officer, Gruppenführer, I think he was in charge of a Panzer Corps. He's quoted as saying that the first meetings of NATO were formed from the international supporters of the SS. Paul Hauser, check him out. He was a general of a Panzer Corps in the Second World War. So the links between the Nazis and the Bilderberg and NATO, I mean, it's a no-brainer. The other thing is, of course, they were set up after World War II to stop Europeans getting sympathy with the Russians and with the Soviet Union, you know. So there was a horrendous agreement obviously made at the end of World War II between mainly the US and the Nazis. Largely this was probably, I think, to do with plutonium and uranium, because the Nazis had been working on an atomic bomb. There's evidence they'd actually exploded a bomb. Churchill was very worried because they had the V2 which could reach London, that they were going to actually put an atom bomb on a V2. And this was seen as a really important bargaining chip for future years after the war. Refined uranium, what's it, U-235 and plutonium. If they could do a deal, the Americans could get that, they'd do almost anything for it.
Fascinating interview, fascinating history. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. That was really amazing.
Fantastic.
Let's talk afterwards.
Lovely
when you're
to meet
done.
you, man.
Lovely to meet you. Give me a hug.
Hey.
Expand on your quote when you said military men are dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns for foreign policy.
I never said that.
Bob Woodward said you said that.
Bob Woodward never told.
Nancy, which way do you want to go?
He's the guy who